Hey, everybody, what's going on? What's hot? What's hip? What's happening? What is shaking on your Pearl Harbor anniversary Saturday, 83 years ago, Pearl Harbor? Don't worry about likes. Don't worry about shares. Don't worry about retweets. Don't worry about notification bells. This is members only. No donations. None of that stuff. You paid your dues. You got in. Settle back into the thick, rich leather chairs of the Tom Gully Show lounge, surrounded by the mahogany walls, the tastefully placed fern. Tip your drinks and enjoy your waitresses. Oh, people saying hi. People saying hi. People saying hi. We got a heck of a show planned for you today. Cold in Dallas. Got up this morning, got the groceries, did all the stuff, and it was cold. It's still cold. It's 45 degrees. That's chilly. That's chilly for Dallas. Chilly. Oh, by the way, this is an authentic The Old Football Shirt Club Arsenal football. This is from like 1928. Well, it's that style. It's made with wool and all that. Like it's originally was, but it's not. You know what we're saying there. So the plan is I'm going to take you through the whole Pearl Harbor thing. Now behind me is a photo, an aerial photo, obviously, of Pearl Harbor taken about a month before the actual attack. I'm going to show it to you here in a second. It's going to be awesome. So this is a high-res photo of Pearl Harbor a month before the attack. Hold on. And notice up here at the top, that's the escape from the harbor. It'll be important later on. Hold on. See all the battleships and all the things lined up? See those? Now, one of the things I'm going to do as we go through this today is I'm going to show you things from the Japanese perspective. We've seen everything probably in various documentaries and footage from World War II, and I'll show you a little bit of that in photos. But we're going to show you some things from the Japanese perspective. They too had cameras. They too were documenting things and had plans and documents that, well, you really just, you don't get to see anymore. Really, they don't show them that often. And later on, we'll have a special guest appearance from the President of the United States. Not Joe Biden, not the president-elect, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We'll have a special guest appearance by FDR. So why don't we get right into it here and boogie. Let me see here. I did more studying for this last night and today than you can possibly believe. You really can't possibly imagine how much studying I actually did for this. I'm telling you. Let's get into some of this photography, okay? Now, those of you listening in podcast form won't be able to see these things, but I will describe them in such vivid detail, it will create an indelible image in the picture of your mind. Bet you didn't think you'd have your mind played with today. I wish Macintosh wouldn't give me Apple News spotlights when I'm doing things, but they do. All right, here we go. This photo here is actually, let me blow this up for you real quick. This is a photo that was taken aboard one of the Japanese aircraft that was attacking Pearl Harbor. And if you look to the center of this photograph, you can see where other aircraft have already started bombing. So this was not a lead aircraft, but it was pretty close. As you can see, there's a little smoke in the air here and there. You can see, if you look really closely, you can see other Japanese fighters, bombers, and torpedo boats. Torpedo bombers that are attacking the location. So this is a photo of the very beginning of the attack. Now, that's important, but we have a lot to cover in terms of what led up to this attack that not many people know. As we all know, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack. We were not expecting it. And that was the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Yeah. And it was 8 o'clock in the morning, local time there in Hawaii on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. At the time, World War II had already begun, and the United States was neutral. They didn't pick any side. We were doing things with Lend-Lease and things of that nature, but we were not a participant, nor did we want to be a participant. This attack, as we all know, led to the United States formally entering World War II on the side of the Allies the very next day. And interestingly enough, Japanese military leadership referred to this attack as Hawaii Operation and Operation AI. Coincidence? I don't think so. Also, it was known as Operation Z during their planning. Now, the Empire of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was preceded by months and months and months and months of negotiations between the United States and Japan over the future of the Pacific. And the Japanese were very concerned about the fact that the United States was growing as a power, and they wanted unfettered ability to control that region. The United States, though, because of the war against China, the Second Sino-Japan War, and the access they had to the Dutch East Indies, sanctioned Japan. One of the things they sanctioned was petroleum. Japan doesn't have its own petroleum. So the United States, of course, did. And expecting the United States during these negotiations to say, we don't think we're going to lift these sanctions, the Japanese leadership sent out these attack groups just prior to receiving what was called the Hull Note. Basically, it was the United States saying, these are the conditions under which we're going to continue, which was basically either you stop doing the things we don't like or we'll continue the sanctions. And that included that Japan get out of China and French Indochina, which later became Vietnam. Japan did not see this as the beginning of war in their twisted minds. They thought this was a preventative action. They thought that if they prevented the United States Pacific Fleet from interfering with all these military actions that they had planned, they'd already planned them in Southeast Asia, and against the other countries, the United Kingdom's protected territories, the Netherlands' protected territories, and of course the United States. And over the course of 7 hours, Pearl Harbor was not the only thing that was attacked. They coordinated attack on the U.S.-held Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, and on the British Empire and Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So this was part of a much larger sort of offensive that was intended to sort of destabilize everyone so that Japan could rush in and take over all these territories. So the attack on Pearl Harbor really started at about 7:48 in the morning, Hawaiian time. And the base was attacked by 353 Imperial Japanese aircraft, and that included fighters, level and dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. And those arrived in 2 waves. And we'll get into these waves in just a second because each wave had a specific purpose. And there was originally planned to be 3 waves. And the cancellation of the 3rd wave also very controversial, at least from a Japanese standpoint. Of the 8 United States battleships that were there, all of them were damaged. 4 of them were sunk. Now, of those 4, all but the USS Arizona were later salvaged and refurbished. 6 of those went into service and went on to fight in the war. The Japanese also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and 1 mine layer. More than 180 U.S. aircraft were destroyed. A total of 2,393 Americans were killed, and 1,178 others were wounded, making it the deadliest foreign attack against the United States in history until September 11th. Interesting that 2,393 killed, 1,178 wounded. Typically, wounded figures are some multiplication of casualties, and that kind of shows how effective the Japanese plan was. Very important things, though, on the base at Pearl Harbor, like the power station, the dry dock, the shipyard, the maintenance area, the fuel and torpedo storage facilities, as well as the submarine piers and the headquarters building, which was the home of the intelligence section. Those were not attacked. So those were still intact after Pearl Harbor was attacked, and that's what allowed the U.S. to rebound so quickly. Japanese losses were very light. 29 aircraft and 5 midget subs were lost, and 129 killed. Japan declared war on the United States and the British Empire later that day. It was actually December the 8th in Tokyo. But the declarations of war were not delivered until the following day. The British government declared war on Japan immediately after learning that their territory had been attacked, while also the next day the United States Congress declared war on Japan. On December 11th, although they had no formal obligation to do so under the tripartite pact with Japan, Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States, which responded with a declaration of war against Germany and Italy. So this attack not just brought the U.S. into the World War on the Pacific theater, but also over in Europe. And it was like, bring it on. You want some of this? Germany, Italy? That's fine. It was unprecedented for the unannounced attack by Japan. This has never happened. No formal warning whatsoever. And that was required by the Hague Convention of 1907. And the perception that the attack had been unprovoked led then President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in the very opening line of his speech, to famously label that day, as we will cover in not too many minutes. The war, or the possibility of war, I'm gonna put this up. It's a little ahead of where I am in this particular timeline. Let's see here. Rumfeld says, regrets, I have a few, but then again, too few to mention. But this is the actual plan, and this is the actual plan that the Japanese had for the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is sort of the shorthand. This is what we're going to do, which you don't see very often. That's an actual Japanese thing there. But the war, or the possibility of war, between the Empire of Japan and the United States was really seen as something that was going to be possible, or that might happen, since back in the 1920s. Japan was very wary of American expansion in the Pacific and into Asia since the late 1890s. And that followed, the annexation of islands such as the Philippines and Hawaii, which the Japanese felt were close to or within their sphere of influence. And Japanese soil, Japanese-owned territory, was seen as a holy thing by many people in Japan. At the very same time, Japanese had these sort of forecasters, strategic thinkers, that thought Japan needed economic self-sufficiency in order to even go to war in the modern era. The experiences they had during World War I taught the Japanese that modern wars would be long, and they would require logistics, mobilization, and that would create vulnerabilities for trade embargoes and encirclement. As a consequence, Japan needed to access very important strategic resources like iron and oil that they couldn't get at least in sufficient enough levels to go to war on the home islands of Japan. Now, Japan had begun to take a pretty hostile stance toward the United States after the United States had this proposal called the Racial Equality Proposal. Actually, that was proffered forth by Japan, but the U.S. didn't want to sign it. However, they remained trading partners. Things really got tense when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. And over about the next 10 years, Japan expanded into China, leading to the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. And Japan, it took a lot of effort for them to isolate China and secure their resources. So starting in December of 1937, the Japanese actually attacked a U.S. ship, the USS Panay. And basically, the Japan bombed a U.S. Navy river gunboat, the Panay, and 3 Standard Oil tankers on the Yangtze River near Nanjing. And they weren't at war, nothing else. And then there was the Nanking Massacre, which was the mass murder of Chinese civilians by the Imperial Japanese Army in Nanjing, the capital of the Republic of China. And that made people in the West very much against Japan. The United States wanted the help of the United Kingdom to blockade Japan, and that didn't work. But in 1938, following President Roosevelt's involvement, American companies stopped providing Japan with the implements of war. It was like, anything you can go to war with, you're not getting from us. In 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, attempting to stop the flow of supplies that reached China. French Indochina, by the way, later Vietnam. The United States halted shipments of airplanes, parts, machine tools, aviation gasoline to Japan, which Japan perceived as very hostile. The United States did not stop oil exports, however, partly because in Washington, D.C., they thought, hey, they're dependent on us for oil, so if we cut that off, they're definitely going to war with us. In the middle of 1940, President Roosevelt moved the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Hawaii. So the United States was kind of going, look, we're not waiting for you to get to our shores. We're going to put you in Pearl Harbor. He also ordered a military buildup in the Philippines, and he did these things in hope of discouraging Japanese aggression in the Far East. And because the Japanese high command, which not the brightest guys in the world, they very foolishly thought that any attack on the United Kingdom's Southeast Asian colonies, like Singapore, would bring the U.S. into the war, and a devastating preventive strike was, in their minds, the only way to keep the U.S. from interfering with them, with their Navy. And the war planners in Japan also thought that invading the Philippines was a definitive thing they were going to have to do. It was like, this is a layup. We definitely have to do that. The Americans, on the other hand, had this thing called War Plan Orange that said, we need to put about 40,000 men on the Philippines. And they never really did that because Douglas MacArthur was like, we're going to need 10 times more of that, people. We don't just need elites. We need like 40,000 fighting men. By 1941, American forecasters expected to have to abandon the Philippines at the outbreak of the war. And later that year, Admiral Thomas C. Hart, who was the commander of the United States Asiatic Fleet, was given orders basically to that effect. If the war breaks out, we're going to have to concede the Philippines. The United States finally did what a lot of people thought would happen and what they were avoiding, but Japan just would not budge. And they ceased all their oil exports to Japan. Because of this decision, Japan proceeded to get their oil by taking and invading the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. And on the 17th of August of 1941, Roosevelt warned Japan that America was prepared to take opposing steps if neighboring countries were attacked. So, Japan and the United States engaged in negotiations during 1941, and they were trying to improve relations between the two countries. Wasn't going well, by the way. Wasn't really working out. During these negotiations, Japan offered to withdraw from most of China and French Indochina after making peace with the governments there. And it also proposed to adopt an independent interpretation of the Tripartite Act and to refrain from trade discrimination, provided all the other nations did the same. And Washington said, nah, I don't think so. I don't think so. You invaded those other countries, took them over. That's why you're at peace with their government, and you're still invading force there, and you just want our stuff. The Japanese prime minister then said, I'd like to meet with you, President Roosevelt. And Roosevelt said, we can meet right after you sign this agreement. The American ambassador to Japan repeatedly urged Roosevelt to accept the meeting, warning that it was the only way to preserve the conciliatory government and attain peace in the Pacific. But that recommendation was just like, yeah, right, tell your story walking. And the government that was in place and the prime minister in place collapsed in the following month when the Japanese military rejected a withdrawal of all troops from China. So the government was saying, if we withdraw these troops, we can get the oil and the other things you need to kind of take over this area. And the military says, nah, we're not going to withdraw from China. Again, the Japanese high command, not the brightest. I mean, we dropped an atomic bomb on them, and they said, that was a fluke. So 3 days later, another one, because they didn't want to surrender, even after the first bomb was dropped on. In their defense, when the atomic bomb was dropped, and we'll do a show on it sometime, it was so devastating that no word got out. Everything was destroyed. And many of the people making decisions hadn't actually gone to see the effects. And they were like, who cares? They bombed a city. We're still at war. Okay, we got a little something else to try for you. Interesting side note. The Japanese, after we dropped the first one and they kind of figured out what happened, part of the reason they still wanted to go to war was like a bomb like that, that's got to be the only one they have. When we dropped the second one, Japanese were fearful that the United States had a whole bunch of them. And that's why they went, okay, we get it. Sorry, didn't mean it. At any rate, Japan's final proposal in these negotiations was delivered on November 20th and offered to withdraw from southern Indochina and to not attack anyone in the southeast. Of course, we'd seen Hitler make these same promises, so we weren't exactly that trusting. And they would only do that as long as the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Netherlands supplied 1 million U.S. gallons of aviation fuel, which I'm sure they would have gladly used to attack us, and lifted the rest of their sanctions against Japan and quit giving money to China and all the other kinds of aid. And the Americans, us, we said, tell you what, we have a counter proposal. And they presented it to the Japanese 6 days later. And that was called the Hull Note. It required Japan to completely evacuate China without conditions and conclude non-aggression pacts with Pacific powers. On the day before we gave them that note, the Japanese task force left port for Pearl Harbor. So they were negotiating, but they had already left. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, it was intended by the Japanese to be a preventative attack. to keep the United States Pacific Fleet from messing with what they wanted to do in Southeast Asia, and also against the overseas territories of the United Kingdom and Netherlands. Over the course of 7 hours, there were coordinated Japanese attacks on American-held, again, Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, and on the British Empire in Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. From the Japanese point of view, it was seen as a preemptive strike before the oil gauge ran empty. They're wanting to do all this while they still have the oil to do it, and that's now. Because as time went on, they knew they would have less and less because we weren't giving it to them. So, as you can see from the plans in front of you, and those of you who can read Japanese, enjoy, the preliminary planning began in early 1941 under the auspices of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, then the commanding officer over Japan's combined fleet, and he got permission to begin formal planning and training for an attack from the Imperial Japanese Navy, only after much arguments and contention in naval headquarters, including, at one point, Yamamoto saying, "I'm going to resign my command if you don't let me do this." Full-scale planning was underway by the spring of 1941, primarily by Rear Admiral Kusaka, Ryunosuke Kusaka, with assistance from Minoru Genda and Yamamoto's Deputy Chief of Staff, Captain Kameto Kurashima. The planners studied the 1940 British air attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto very intensively, and over the next several months, the pilots were trained, equipment was adapted, intelligence was collected. They had a spy on the island there at Pearl Harbor that I'll tell you about in a little while that was giving them all sorts of information. Now, despite all these preparations, Hirohito, the emperor, did not approve the attack plan until November 5th, so just a little more than a month, even after these guys had been planning and training and building and adapting for 9 months or so. And it was the third of a bunch of conferences to consider this very attack. At first, he did not want to engage in war, but eventually he authorized the strike on Pearl Harbor, despite certain advisors telling him this is a terrible idea. And the final authorization was not given by the emperor until December 1st, and by that time, that task force was already halfway to Pearl Harbor. After a majority of Japanese leaders advised him the Hull note would destroy the fruits of the China incident and it would endanger Manchukuo and undermine Japanese control of Korea. Before the attack, he became more involved in military matters. You know, the emperor is a big deal over there in Japan, considered almost godlike. He even joined the Conference of Military Counselors, which was considered very unusual for him. He didn't really involve himself in matters of that kind for two reasons. One, he wasn't interested, and two, the Japanese military's high command was very stubborn, very pig-headed, and they didn't really want to hear from the emperor. But they had to, and they knew it. Additionally, he sought more and more information about the war plans. According to one of his aides, he openly displayed happiness upon hearing about the success of the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. And by late 1941, many observers believed the hostilities between the United States and Japan were a fait accompli. It was just going to happen. A Gallup poll just before the attack on Pearl Harbor found that over half, 52% of Americans actually expected war with Japan. 27% said, no, I don't think that's going to happen, and 21% had no opinion. So all the American Pacific bases and facilities have been placed on alert. Officials didn't think Pearl Harbor would be the first target. They thought the Philippines would be the first place that the Japanese attacked. And they thought that because the threat they had was that air bases throughout the company and the naval base at Manila was enough of a deterrent, and that the Japanese had trade routes to the south that the U.S. could not mess with as much. So they thought that the Japanese would kind of slowly work their way toward Pearl. And, they also thought that the Japanese could not do one major naval operation, more than one at a time. So the Japanese were quite, busy with another operation or two, and they said, there's no way they will attack Pearl Harbor. They can't do that. Now, the attack, and let's just show you another attack photo here real quick. This is actually a photo taken from the deck of the Akagi, a Japanese aircraft carrier, as they were taking off for Pearl Harbor. So there they are getting ready for the attack. Yes. You don't see these Japanese photos that often. But anyway, that's one of them. They wanted to do several things with this sneak attack. First, they wanted to destroy very important American fleet units. They wanted the United States to be hampered, if not completely disabled, in their attempt to prevent the Japanese Pacific Fleet from the conquest of the Dutch East Indies and Malaysia with all that oil, and that would allow Japan to conquer Southeast Asia without any interference. The leaders of the Imperial Japanese Navy wanted this thing called the decisive battle doctrine, and if you can destroy the maximum amount of the enemy's, in this case, battleships, you're going to cripple them for an extended period of time. They'll have to rebuild them. It takes months and maybe even years. The second aim was they wanted to buy time to consolidate their positions in all these places they had just taken over. They wanted to kind of dig in. And that is also because they knew that shipbuilding was a major focus of the United States, and that when the United States really got into high production, they were no fools. They recognized the industrial might of the United States, and they're like, there was this thing called the Vinson-Walsh Act in 1940. And basically, it prescribed the U.S. was going to create the largest naval fleet the world had known at that time. And the Japanese knew this, and they knew that once the United States had done this, they were in big, big, big trouble. And so their idea was, we better attack them now, take over all these areas now, so that we have a fighting chance of holding Southeast Asia. And the third thing they wanted to do was keep the United States from being able to mobilize forces in the Pacific. So it wasn't just kind of a military, we don't want them to be able to fight us on the ocean. We don't want them to be able to transport troops and tanks and bazookas and everything else that they need to fight the war. It was a logistics play. And so lastly, they wanted to destroy the American people's morale so that the American government would just go, okay, let the Japanese do what they want. We'll make peace with them. Look what they did at Pearl Harbor. We don't want none of that smoke. But the Japanese didn't know very much about the American spirit, clearly. Oh, you'd like to cheap shot us from behind? Now, there were disadvantages that the Japanese knew about this attack. All right. The ships in Pearl Harbor had kind of an advantage, even if they were hit by torpedoes and bombs. And that is, Pearl Harbor is a very shallow harbor. So it's like relatively easy to salvage and repair anything that's damaged in the harbor. And most of the crews, I mean, as bad as that casualty total is, most of the crews would survive the attack because most of them would be on shore leave or could be rescued from the harbor. It's not like being out at sea where if you fall off the side of a boat or a boat's damaged, good luck getting saved. Even if you're alive in the water, how are they going to find you? Your ship's at the bottom of the ocean. You're just floating in the endless amount of square miles of the Pacific Ocean. But in the harbor, you jump off of a boat, and even if you're covered in oil, even if you've been burned, they're going to find you. You're in the harbor. So another very important disadvantage, and this is huge. All three of the United States aircraft carriers, the big boys, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, were gone. They weren't in the harbor. They were out on maneuvers or patrols. So you didn't get our aircraft carriers. Bad mistake. Despite these concerns, and incidentally, the Japanese knew that these aircraft carriers were gone because they had the spy. But Yamamoto says, let's go ahead and do this. If we get all their battleships and all their destroyers, that's good enough. The Japanese overconfidence in their ability to win a short war meant that other targets in the harbor, especially the Navy Yard, the oil tank farms, and the submarine base, were left unscathed because the Japanese thought the war would be over before any of those things could really matter. Another bad mistake. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese task force, as I mentioned earlier, it was called the Striking Force, Cobra Kai, of 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the Shokaku, and the Zukaku, departed Hitukapu Bay in Etorofu, excuse me, island in the Kuril Islands, en route to a position northwest of Hawaii, intending to launch its 408 aircraft to attack Pearl Harbor. 360 for the 2 attack waves and 48 that would be on defensive air patrol, combat patrol, just to protect the ships that the aircraft were being launched from, just in case the United States, for whatever reason, might have aircraft that could get to those. They wanted to make sure and have aircraft sort of circling, protecting, so they could get back to Japan. Now, the first wave was to be the primary attack, and the second wave was to attack the carriers as its first objective, and cruisers as its second, with battleships as the third. Now, since the carriers weren't there, they went down a notch on all those objectives. The first wave carried most of the weapons designed to attack capital ships, and they had these specially adapted aerial torpedoes, which were designed with an anti-roll mechanism and a rudder extension that let them operate in shallow water. It would keep the torpedoes from going too low and missing. The aircrafts were ordered to select the highest value targets, which were battleships and aircraft carriers, or if those weren't present, any other high value ships, cruisers, destroyers. First wave dive bombers were attack ground targets, and they were ordered to strafe and destroy as many parked aircraft as possible to ensure they didn't intercept their bombers, especially in the first wave. And when the fighters' fuel got low, they were to refuel aboard the aircraft carriers and then return to combat. Before the attack commenced, the Japanese Imperial Navy launched reconnaissance float planes from heavy cruisers Chikuma and Tone to scout Oahu and Maui, respectively, with orders to report on American fleet composition and location. And, they also sent some subs in there. The submarine story, these mini subs that the Japanese sent in, are kind of a story unto themselves. Just be known that 5 of them got into Pearl Harbor. All 5 of them were destroyed. One of them was grounded twice, and they captured the very first prisoner of war for the Japanese was from one of those midget submarines. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki swam ashore and was captured by Hawaiian National Guard Corporal David Akui, becoming the first Japanese prisoner of war. A fourth had been damaged in a depth charge attack and was abandoned by its crew before it could fire its torpedoes, and it was found outside the harbor in 1960. Japanese forces received a radio message from a midget submarine at about 41 minutes past midnight on December 8th, claiming to have damaged one or more large warships inside Pearl Harbor. In 1992, 2000, and 2001, Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory submersibles found the wreck of a fifth midget submarine lying in 3 parts outside Pearl Harbor. It was in some debris where a lot of American equipment had been dumped after the war. Both of its torpedoes were missing. So I could do a whole show just on these subs. Let me get you another thing here. This is an amazing thing I'll get to in a second. But if you can see here, this is a very, very important historical document. One of the U.S. Military asked the ships, "Is the channel clear? Is channel clear?" This is being taken over the teletype, and this is the shorthand of the person who took it, and then the response: St. Louis has just passed through channel and has cleared. So the St. Louis is saying, "Is the channel clear? Can I get out of here?" And this is the response back. This is the channel clear. At any rate, the attack took place, as we all know now, before any formal declaration of war was made by Japan. But that's not what Yamamoto wanted with this attack. He originally stipulated that the attack should not commence until 30 minutes, thanks for the half hour, after Japan had informed the United States that peace negotiations were ending. But the attack began before the notice could be delivered. And many of you may have heard this story. Tokyo transmitted the 5,000-word notification, commonly referred to as the 14-part message, in 2 blocks to the Japanese embassy in Washington. They didn't even take it to the State Department. Transcribing the message took too long for the Japanese ambassador to deliver it at 1 p.m. Washington time as ordered, and consequently the message was not presented until more than 1 hour after the attack had begun. But American code breakers had already deciphered and translated most of the message hours before it was scheduled to be delivered. The final part of the message is sometimes described as a declaration of war. It wasn't. I'll read it to you in a second. While it was viewed by a number of senior American government military officials as a very strong indicator negotiations were likely to be terminated and that war could happen at any moment, it was neither declared war or wasn't an ending of diplomatic relations. A declaration of war was printed on the front page of Japan's newspapers on the evening edition of December 8th, which is late December 7th in the United States, but it wasn't delivered to the American government until the next day after the attack. So their newspapers back in Japan all were publishing this. But we didn't get the notice until the next day. By the way, they also burned everything they could find inside the embassies in Tokyo and everywhere else. In any event, even if the Japanese had decoded and delivered that 14-part message before the beginning of the attack, it wouldn't have been a formal break of relations or even a declaration of war. The final 2 paragraphs of the message read, "Thus the earnest hope of the Japanese government to adjust Japanese-American relations and to preserve and promote the peace of the Pacific through cooperation with the American government has finally been lost. The Japanese government regrets to notify hereby the American government that in view of the attitude of the American government, it cannot but consider that it is impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations." U.S. naval intelligence officers were freaked out by this weird timing of delivering this message. 1 p.m. on a Sunday, which was 7:30 in the morning in Hawaii. And they tried to alert Pearl Harbor. But remember, this is 1941, and there were communication problems. So the warning was not delivered before the attack. The very first wave of the attack was 183 airplanes led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. That was launched north of Oahu. 6 of the planes failed to launch due to technical difficulties. The first wave included the following: 49 bombers, and these bombers were armed with like armor-piercing bombs that were nearly 2,000 pounds, and 40 bombers armed with those special shallow water torpedoes. The second group in this first wave was made up of 51 dive bombers with general purpose bombs. And the third group, which was to target all of sort of the airfields, Ford Island, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Barbers Point, Kanaone, they put fighters, 43 of them, on those areas to strafe and for air control. So they would strafe all of the aircraft, strafe meaning just shoot in a line any aircraft that were on the ground. Now, when the first wave approached Oahu, it was detected by United States Army radar on the island's northern tip, and that post had been in training mode for months, but it wasn't operational yet. However, they were doing the things that they would normally do because they're training, and a bunch of privates, a whole bunch of them, Privates George Elliott Jr., Joseph Lockhart, they reported a target to Private Joseph McDonald, and he was stationed at Fort Shafter's Intercept Center right near Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler, newly assigned at the thinly manned Intercept Center, presumed that it was the scheduled arrival of 6 B-17 bombers from California. And this gets weird. It is such a coincidence that the island was unprepared and unprotected. And here's why. Because of this scheduled arrival of these B-17 bombers, the Japanese planes were approaching from a direction very close, only a few degrees difference than the bombers were supposed to come in at. And these operators of this radar had never seen a formation as large as the Japanese one that was coming at them on the radar, but they didn't tell Lieutenant Tyler about the size of it. And Lieutenant Tyler, for security reasons, couldn't tell those radar operators about the 6 B-17s that were due, even though everybody kind of knew it was going to happen. But he couldn't say anything about it. Therefore, the operators didn't know that these bombers were coming in. Tyler couldn't tell him he thought it was the bombers. And if either one of those things weren't true, one of them would have said, wow, that's way bigger than 6 bombers. It just didn't happen. And as that first wave approached Oahu, they encountered and shot down several American aircraft. At least one of those radioed a somewhat incoherent warning. Other warnings were received from ships off the harbor entrance, and those were still being processed or waiting to be confirmed when the Japanese assault began at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time. A total of 353 Japanese planes reached Oahu in those 2 waves. Slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers were leading that first wave, and they were able to exploit the first moments of surprise to attack. Even though they were slower and more vulnerable, there was no opposition to them. And they attacked the most important ships that were there, the battleships, while the dive bombers attacked American air bases, began with Hickam Field, the largest, and then went to Wheeler Field. 171 planes in the second wave attacked the Army Air Force's field at Bellows Field. And the only opposition came from a handful of P-36 Hawks, P-40 Warhawks, and some SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise that, were hanging around. In the first wave attack, about 8 of the 49 2,000-pound armor-piercing bombs hit their intended battleship targets. At least 2 of those bombs broke up on impact. Another detonated before penetrating an unarmored deck, and 1 was a dud. 13 of the 40 torpedoes hit battleships, while 4 hit other ships. And the men aboard these ships woke up to the sounds of alarms, bombs exploding, gunfire, and they, had to get their clothes on as they ran to general quarters stations. The famous message, "Air Raid, Pearl Harbor, this is not a drill," was sent to the headquarters of Patrol Wing 2, the first senior Hawaiian command to respond. American servicemen were caught totally unprepared by this attack. Ammunition lockers were locked. Aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip in the open to prevent what they thought was a greater threat at the time, and that was sabotage. They thought it was a much greater threat that a spy or saboteur would get onto the airfield and, do things to the planes. Well, so they parked them out in the open where everybody could see them, and that made them perfect to just get destroyed. Guns were unmanned on all of the anti-aircraft stations. And despite this low alert status, many American personnel responded extremely effectively during the attack. Ensign Joseph Taussig, Jr., aboard the Nevada, commanded the ship's anti-aircraft guns and was severely wounded but remained at his post. Lieutenant Commander F.J. Thomas commanded Nevada in the captain's absence and got the ship underway until it was grounded at 9:10. One of the destroyers, the Alwyn, got underway with only 4 officers aboard. And the 4 officers aboard were all ensigns. Not one of them had more than a year's duty at sea. And she operated at sea for 36 hours until the commanding officer managed to get back on board. Captain Mervyn Bennion, commanding the West Virginia, led his men until he was cut down by fragments from a bomb which hit the Tennessee that happened to be moored right alongside. So let's see if we got another photo or something here for you. Here's more Japanese footage of the attack. And this one, you can see the amazing amounts of devastation that was visited upon Pearl Harbor. That's a Jap Zero. That actually could be a torpedo bomber, but you can see that they're flying away from having just wreaked havoc on Pearl Harbor. Let's see what we got here in our chat. We'll be good. Give us our books back, please. Give us our bombs back, please. Yes. If you liked Fat Man, you'll love Little Boy. We got a little something for you. We got a little something for you. I almost want to leave this picture up to let you guys look at it while I do a little more here. The second wave had 171 planes. And the first group had some 54 B5Ns armed with 550-pound and 132-pound general-purpose bombs. Also, the second group of that wave was 78 D3As armed with 550-pound general-purpose bombs. And the third group had 35 A6Ms for defense and strafing, so those were more fighters. The second wave was divided into 3 groups. One was tasked to attack the location of Kanaoe, and the rest Pearl Harbor proper. The separate sections arrived at the attack point almost simultaneously from different directions. 90 minutes after it began, the attack was over. 2,008 sailors were killed and 710 others wounded. 218 soldiers and airmen who were part of the Army prior to the independent United States Air Force in 1947 were killed, 364 wounded. 109 Marines were killed, 69 wounded, and 68 civilians were killed and 35 wounded. In total, 2,403 Americans were killed, 1,178 wounded. 18 ships were sunk or run aground, including 5 battleships. All of the Americans killed or wounded during the attack were legally non-combatants, given that there was no state of war. when the attack occurred. Of the American fatalities, nearly half were due to the explosion of the Arizona's forward magazine after she was hit by a modified 16-inch shell. And the vast majority of the U.S. sailors killed at Pearl Harbor were junior enlisted personnel. The officers of the Navy all lived in houses, and the junior people were the ones on the boats. So pretty much all the people who died in the direct line of the attack were very junior people. So everyone is about 17 or 18. The Honolulu Fire Department responded to Hickam Field during the bombings in Honolulu, becoming the only fire department members on American soil to be attacked by a foreign power in history. 6 firefighters were wounded by Japanese shrapnel, but quite a few died while battling flames inside the hangar of, I believe, Hickam Field after a Japanese bomb crashed through the roof of the hangar. Already damaged by a torpedo and on fire amidships, the Nevada attempted to exit the harbor. She was targeted by many Japanese bombers as she got underway and sustained more hits from 250-pound bombs, which started more fires. She was deliberately beached to avoid risking blocking the harbor entrance if she sank there. And by the way, if that harbor entrance had been blocked, that would have been problematic for the U.S. fleet. The California was hit by 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes. The crew might have kept her afloat, but they were ordered to abandon ship just as they were raising power for the pumps. Burning oil from Arizona and West Virginia drifted down toward her and probably made the situation look worse than it actually was. The disarmed target ship Utah was nailed twice by torpedoes. West Virginia was hit by 7 torpedoes, the 7th tearing away her rudder. So, she was basically inoperable. The Oklahoma was hit by 4 torpedoes, the last 2 above her belt armor, which caused her to capsize. Belt armor is the armor that sort of surrounds the ship underneath the waterline. The Maryland was hit by 2 of the converted 16-inch shells, but neither caused serious damage. Now, the Japanese concentrated on the battleships because they were the biggest ships there, but they didn't ignore the other targets. The light cruiser Helena was torpedoed, and the concussion from that blast capsized the neighboring mine layer Oglala. 2 destroyers in dry dock, the Cassine and the Downs, were destroyed when bombs penetrated their fuel bunkers. That fuel caught fire and then flooded the dry dock in an effort to fight fire. Of the 402 American aircraft in Hawaii, 188 were destroyed, 159 damaged, 155 of them on the ground. Almost none were actually ready to take off to defend the base. 8 Army Air Force pilots managed to get airborne during the attack, and 6 were credited with downing at least 1 Japanese aircraft during the attack. I could tell you their names, but that would just take up time. Friendly fire brought down some American planes, including 4 from an inbound flight from the Enterprise. At the time of the attack, 9 civilian aircraft were flying in the vicinity of Pearl Harbor. Of these, 3 of them were shot down. Yeah. Now, this third wave I spoke of earlier, it never happened. And there were a lot of people. By the way, I think this is I want to say this is the West Virginia. Hold on, I'll tell you exactly which one it is. This is the Arizona, excuse me. I'll show you the West Virginia in just a second. According to most accounts, several Japanese junior officers wanted Nagumo to carry out a third strike in order to sink more of the remaining warships and to get at those maintenance shops and the dry dock and the oil tank yards. Most historians have cast doubt on these claims. Genda also said, without 3 strikes, we might not have, waves, we might as well not have even come here. But regardless, it's undisputed that the captains of the other 5 carriers in the task force reported they were ready and willing and able to carry out a third strike right after that second wave returned. But Nagumo decided to withdraw, and he had reasons. Okay? First reason is American anti-aircraft performance had improved considerably during the second strike. 2/3 of Japan's losses on that day happened during the second wave. So the first wave caught us with our pants down. Second wave, hey, if we can get to something that shoots at a plane, we will get to it and we will shoot your ass out of the sky as best we can. Nagumo felt if he launched a third strike, he would be risking 3/4 of the combined fleet's strength to wipe out the remaining targets, like those facilities, and he was fearful that doing that would cause him to suffer much greater aircraft losses. Now, the location of the American carriers remained unknown. He didn't know where they were, Nagumo. And so he was concerned that his fleet, or the ships that were behind this attack, were now within range of American land-based bombers. So he was not really sure whether the U.S. had enough planes remaining on Hawaii to launch an attack against his carriers. He didn't know. So tough to make a decision when you don't know. That third wave of attack would also have required substantial preparation and turnaround time, because he would have to gather the intelligence from the pilots from the second wave and find out what needed to be hit so he could get in and get out really quickly, and that would take time. And it also meant that any planes that engaged in that third wave would have to land at night. And at that time, only the British Royal Navy had developed night carrier techniques, so this was a big risk, having these guys try to land at nighttime. And those first two waves had launched all of their air strength. That third wave would have required landing both the first and the second wave before they launched the third wave. So the task force fuel situation also did not allow him to hang out in the waters north of Pearl Harbor much longer, since he was at the very limit of his fuel supply. The longer he goes, the less chance he's going to get back. So had he stayed there for the third wave, he would have gotten sort of unacceptably low on fuel and might have had to abandon the destroyer escorts that he had on the way back to Japan. He also believed the second strike had really done everything that the mission's objectives required. Neutralized the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He didn't want to have any more losses, and so he relied on the Imperial Japanese Navy's practice of conserving strength in, your fleet rather than the total destruction of the enemy. And this was something they did in other battles against other forces. Although this third strike, it's hypothetical, of course, probably would have focused on the big ships, the warships. Historians have said any potential damage to the shore facilities would have hampered the Pacific Fleet way more than hitting those battleships and destroyers. If the oil tank yards and the dry docks and all that had been destroyed, American operations in the Pacific would have been postponed for more than a year, and it would have achieved the Japanese goal of, hey, we want to keep them out of the war for as long as we can so we can strengthen our positions and expand our influence. And that's according to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. He said it would have prolonged the war another 2 years. So there you go. Let me give you a picture. This would be the West Virginia right here. That's the West Virginia. So those pictures of amazing. Amazing. Yeah, Rumble Podcast. A third strike might have made us really mad. Yeah, it might have. I wonder what that would have been like. I think we were pretty mad. The battleships that we had damaged. The Arizona was hit by 4 armor-piercing bombs. It exploded. It was a total loss. It wasn't salvaged. 1,177 dead. Roughly half of those killed were from the Arizona, or the explosions and debris, shrapnel from the Arizona. And of course, the Arizona, if you've ever been over there, is now a memorial under the water. The Oklahoma was hit by 5 torpedoes. It was capsized, total loss, but it was salvaged. It did sink en route to scrapping on May 1947, 429 dead. West Virginia was hit by 2 bombs, 7 torpedoes, and sunk, but it was returned to service in July of 1944, 106 dead. The California was hit by 2 bombs, 2 torpedoes, and sunk. It was returned to service in January of 1944. The Nevada was hit by 6 bombs, 1 torpedo, beached, but returned to service in October of 1942, 60 dead. The Pennsylvania was in dry dock with the Cassine and the Downs. It was hit by 1 bomb and debris from the Cassine. It remained in service, 9 dead. Tennessee hit by 2 bombs, returned to service February 1942, 5 dead. Maryland was hit by 2 bombs, returned to service in February of 1942, 4 dead. The Utah, which was a training ship, was hit by 2 torpedoes, capsized, total loss. The salvage was abandoned at some point, 64 dead, and it was later also memorialized. The cruisers, the Helena, the Raleigh, and the Honolulu just remained in service, even though it had been hit. They fixed it quite easily. The Helena and the Raleigh were hit by 1 torpedo each, and they both returned to service in early 1942, so very quickly. The destroyers, the Cassine, the Downs, the Helm, and the Shah. The Cassine was hit by a bomb and burned, but it was reconstructed, returned to service February 1944. The Downs caught fire from the Cassine, was reconstructed and returned to service. I could go through some more of these things, but those are the main big ones. Now, the salvage was under the auspices of Homer N. Wallen, Captain Homer N. Wallen, and he was the guy that was ordered to leave a formal salvage operation. Formal salvage operation. Around Pearl Harbor, divers from the Navy and the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard and some civilian contractors from the Pacific Bridge Company and others. You know, these civilians were like, hey, we're not doing nothing. Let's rock. And they began work on the ships that could be refloated. They patched holes, they cleared debris, they pumped water out of the ships. Navy divers worked inside the damaged ships. Within 6 months, 5 battleships and 2 cruisers were patched or refloated so they could be sent to the shipyards in Pearl Harbor and on the mainland for extensive repair. The salvage operations continued for another year, a total of some 20,000 man-hours underwater. Arizona and the target ship Utah were too heavily damaged for salvage and just remained where they sunk, with the Arizona becoming a war memorial. The Oklahoma, while it was successfully raised, was never repaired and capsized while under tow to the mainland in 1947. The Nevada proved particularly difficult to raise and repair. 2 men involved in the operation died after inhaling poisonous gases that had accumulated in the ship's interior. Whenever feasible, armament and equipment were removed from vessels too damaged to repair and put to use to improve the anti-aircraft defense of the harbor or installed above other craft. I could go into the news coverage of this. It's quite extensive. There was actually television coverage. Commercial television had just begun 6 months earlier, and only a few thousand TV sets existed, most of which were in New York. But WNBT in New York was the only station that was regularly airing that day in the country, with the comedy movie Millionaire Playboy being interrupted with news of the attack. I could get into the other stuff. The news coverage in Japan was, as you might have imagined it, early and the great and glorious blah, blah, blah. Now, we have a special guest star. The day after the attack, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech to the joint session of Congress, calling for a formal declaration of war on the Empire of Japan. I have invited the president to appear here. There he is. He's making his way toward the dais. Let me see here. And this is going to take a little while. It's like 7 or 8 minutes long. But I think it's important. And I think it is something that you might like to hear. You probably have heard one thing from it, as most of us have. But it does a good job of explaining how the United States felt. And this is just the day after the attack upon Pearl Harbor. And think of it. What did we feel like the day after 9/11?
Senators and representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States.
President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the of Japan.
I just realized
was still in
I just shut the audio off.
with its government
Someone
and
back
its
this
emperor,
back up.
looking toward the maintenance.
I have all of my audio running through this special setup here, and I sometimes forget. Here we go. Let's back it up a little, shall we? Take 2. Mr. President, sorry.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat or hint of war or of armed attack. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Now, not to get too crazy about it, nothing unites the American people Like attacking one of our warships, man. Don't do it. Don't sink the Lusitania. Don't do that stuff because we don't like it. And as you could hear, Congress was in full support of the declaration of war. Congress obliged that request less than an hour later. And just a few days later, December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, even though the tripartite pact didn't require them to do that. Congress issued a declaration of war against Germany and Italy later that same day. It's like, okay, you want to play? Let's play. The United Kingdom had already been at war with Germany since September of 1939 and with Italy since June of 1940. And British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had promised to declare war within the hour of a Japanese attack on the United States. And upon learning of the Japanese attacks upon Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong, Churchill promptly determined there was no need to either wait or consult with the U.S. government and immediately summoned the Japanese ambassador. And as a result, the United Kingdom declared war on Japan 9 hours before the United States did. The attack was shocking, of course, to all the allies in the Pacific theater. Further losses compounded this huge setback. Japan attacked the Philippines hours later. Only 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse were sunk off the coast of Malaysia, causing Churchill later to recollect, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock. As I turned and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor who were hastening back to California. Over this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme and we, everywhere, were weak and naked." Throughout the war, Pearl Harbor was frequently used in American propaganda. Posters that said "Avenge December 7th" were everywhere. One further consequence of the attack on Pearl Harbor was its aftermath, and notably the Japanese American residents and citizens who were relocated to nearby Japanese American internment camps. Within hours of the attack, hundreds of Japanese American leaders were rounded up and taken to high security camps such as Sand Island and the mouth of Honolulu Harbor and elsewhere. Eventually, more than 110,000 Japanese Americans who all lived on the West Coast were forced into interior camps, but in Hawaii, where the 150,000 plus Japanese Americans composed over 1/3 of the population, only about 1,200 to 1,800 were interred. Internationally, British Columbia had a lot of Japanese immigrants and descendants, and that meant the Canadian government reacted, and they passed the War Measures Act, allowing the forced removal of any and all Canadians of Japanese descent from British Columbia. And those people were also placed in internment camps. In the wake of the attack, this is after this attack on Pearl Harbor, 15 medals of honor, 51 Navy crosses, 53 Silver Stars, 4 Navy and Marine Corps medals, 1 Distinguished Flying Cross, 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, and 3 Bronze Star medals were awarded to American servicemen who distinguished themselves in combat at Pearl Harbor. Additionally, a special military award, the Pearl Harbor Commemorative Medal, was later authorized for all military veterans of the attack. Let's see here. I won't get into the Doolittle raid or any of the debates on American intelligence and what they knew or thought. Let me see here. I want to tell you about this spy that had been hanging around. Our good friend Takeo Yoshikawa. Yeah. He was a 1933 graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, and he served briefly at sea aboard the Asama, as well as some submarines. He began training as a naval pilot near the end of 1934, and then had a severe stomach ailment, a stomach ache, that prevented him from completing his training. He was subsequently discharged from the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1936 and thought about committing harikari and committing suicide. But a year later, he began a career in naval intelligence, being assigned to Japanese headquarters for the Navy in Tokyo, and he became an expert on the U.S. Navy, just ravenously, taking in all of the information that he could possibly get his hands on. And while on intelligence duty, he intercepted a shortwave radio message in English that 17 troop transport were en route to England. And he passed this information along to the German embassy, and many of the ships were destroyed as a result. Thanks. Yoshikawa subsequently received a personal letter of thanks from Adolf Hitler. Now, I don't want to be, a nervous Nelly. I don't want to, cast aspersions on anyone unfairly here. But if you get a personal letter of thanks from Adolf Hitler, let's just say you can't been up to something good. God, I got a breaking news announcement here on my phone. I used to be a news anchor, and it's for the WWE. Don't we have a little higher standard, folks, for breaking news these days? Can we not interrupt me for anyway? Adolf Hitler. Perhaps you've heard of him. In the words of Norm Macdonald, this Hitler guy, the more I learn of him, the less I care for him. Okay, so he had this expertise in the U.S. Navy. So Yoshikawa was sent to Hawaii, posing as a vice consul named Tadashi Morimura. And he arrived in March of 1941. He rented a second-story apartment that overlooked Pearl Harbor and would often wander around the island of Oahu taking notes on fleet movements and security measures. He rented small airplanes at John Rogers Airport and flew around observing U.S. installations. He also dove under the harbor using a hollow reed as a breathing apparatus. He gained information by taking the Navy's own harbor tugboat and listening to local gossip. He worked closely with German agent Bernard Kuhn, as well as another former graduate of the Japanese Naval Academy, Kokichi Seki, an untrained spy who served as the consulate's treasurer. According to Yoshikawa, although some 160,000 persons of Japanese ancestry lived in Hawaii at the time, he never tried to make use of them in his espionage activities. They agreed that Hawaii should be the easiest place to carry out such work in view of the population, so they could just blend in. And they looked upon the locals, the Japanese living in the United States and Hawaii, they were very much beneath them, And he even said those men of influence and character who might have assisted me in my secret mission were unanimously uncooperative. And so he made regular use of a Japanese-American military veteran, a driver that the consulate had been using, who he valued because that guy was trusted by Americans. And another Japanese-American working at the consulate general brought at least one airplane ticket in his own name for Yoshikawa to use, because Yoshikawa wanted to avoid suspicion because of all these tickets he was buying. He also had a favorite taxi driver, an immigrant with Japanese military experience, who at least on one occasion hid his taxi outside the consulate general to help Yoshikawa avoid surveillance at the beginning of his route. Excuse me. Although he didn't know anything about the planned attack, he assumed that his intelligence would help prepare for the eventual attack of Pearl Harbor, and he worked nonstop to that end. His reports were transmitted to the Japanese in a special code to the foreign ministry, who passed them on to the Navy. Now, the code had been broken by Allied code breakers, and messages to and from Tokyo were intercepted and decrypted. Communications between Tokyo and the consulate were considered low priority because there were so many messages that were completely commercial in nature. Remember, they were still trying to get our oil, and they were still trying to get our iron, and so there was a lot of just regular, tanker leaving with this, and we're waiting on that, and blah, blah, blah. Now, one message was sent on September 24th, and it should have received more attention. It divided Pearl Harbor into 5 distinct zones and requested that the location and number of warships be indicated on a plot, a grid of the harbor. But due to delays caused by staff shortages and other things, the message wasn't decrypted and distributed until mid-October, and then it was dismissed as being inconsequential. But it was the reports that he sent twice a week based on that request that enabled Yamamoto to finalize his plan for the attack. When he heard the East Wind Rain code phrase on the shortwave radio that brought news from Tokyo, that was the signal that an attack against the United States was to proceed, and he immediately destroyed all evidence of his activities. When the FBI picked him up on the day of the attack, there was no incriminating evidence of his espionage. He eventually returned to Japan in August of 1942 in a diplomat prisoner exchange. It was not known for some time that he was the top rat that was in Hawaii. He worked for naval intelligence during the rest of the war, and when the war ended and Japan was occupied by U.S. forces, he went into hiding. He disguised himself as a Buddhist monk because, when you're a scumbag, you do the most scummy thing you can do, and that's what he did. For fear of being prosecuted for his role in the Pearl Harbor attack, he returned to his wife, who he married right after he got back from the U.S., when the occupation by the U.S. ended. That brave man. He never received any official recognition of his services during the war. In 1955, he opened a candy business, but it failed. Why did it fail? People found out what he did, and that's why it failed. The locals blamed him for the war. He says, they even blame me for the atomic bomb. He was penniless, and he was jobless, and he was supported by his wife for the rest of his life. She was an insurance salesman. He said, my wife alone shows me great respect. Every day she bows to me. She knows I am a man of history, and he died in a nursing home. Over the years, sort of mysterious spies have been mentioned in history books, but while the Yoshikawa case was used to retroactively justify the decision to intern Japanese Americans, he claimed that he distrusted the Japanese American community and was loyal, that community, to America over Japan. That's all I got to tell you about Pearl Harbor on this anniversary. 83 years. And Japan, we're kind of cool now, but we haven't forgotten. I haven't forgotten. I'm old, but I had an uncle that fought in the Pacific Theater in World War II. Kind of decorated. Was at Iwo Jima. Was at Saipan. And I won't go too far into it. He did not hate Asian people. He married a Korean woman. But if you were Japanese, didn't want to be around him for too long. I don't care if it was the grocery store. I don't care if it was at a parking lot somewhere. We were one place, and he started talking about some guy, and the guy was looking at him, and what are you looking at? Well, look somewhere else. I mean, he did not have any tolerance for people of Japanese heritage. So we haven't really forgotten. You did that. And forgive? Forget? Here it is 83 years later. A date which will live in infamy. And it has. At any rate, let's see. Rumpled trench coat. Oh, you've attacked us by surprise? And your friends want in too? Okay, starts rolling up the sleeve. All right. Hurts, don't it? Tell your friends. What I got going on here? This crazy old-fashioned shirt. There we go. This was a soccer jersey back in the 1920s. I'm not joking. Rumpled trench coat says, A. Hitler is not someone you'd ask for a reference when changing jobs. The Chancellor of Germany says I'm cool. Let's see here. Great job, Tom. Fascinating. You know, actually, the Germans, I mean, to a certain extent, you can say they should be mad at the Japanese. You know, it's like, are you the one that put that? And then there's that great saying, I fear that all we have done is to awaken a slumbering giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. That's what happened. They made a movie called Midway just a few years ago. Watch it. It starts at Pearl Harbor. And that movie will give you an idea. We just went through the list, and we talked about how quickly all of these battleships and destroyers were put back into service. But our fleet was crippled. We had enough to go out there and do things, but that was it. There was nobody on the bench. And our captains of industry, and I believe it was Henry Ford, there's a really good, I believe it's History Channel miniseries about all of the people, DuPont, Ford, all of these giant industrial guys getting together at the request of the government to build the war machine. Okay? And Henry Ford was the one that said, you're building your battleships and these ships all wrong. The way you're doing it is stupid. You shouldn't be building a ship up from scratch. You should have people like he did with his cars. You should have certain people building the structure. You should have another certain people building the internal parts and shipping them to and installing them. And it's a wonderful, wonderful miniseries. Julian Zeezer quite rightfully says there is the Nihau incident involving a Japanese aviator, downed Japanese aviator, often used as justification for the internments. Yes, that Nihau was the Japanese's agreed upon meeting point if any of the ships or aircraft ran into trouble. That's where they were told to meet. And so one of the Japanese aviators did down his plane there and was quickly rounded up by the locals. But I was going to go over that, but it was just sort of a one-off. But that was something that was used as a justification for the internments. And all of the justifications for the internments were retroactive. None of them were particularly binding on anything that had actually been done. Julian Zeus says, good YouTube miniseries called Unauthorized History of the Pacific War by Army Historian and Navy Captain. Well, that sounds pretty good. I'm going to have to check that out. This captains of industry thing, though, was amazing, because they to a large extent, were competitors. And getting them to sort of agree, Henry Ford didn't want to let loose with any of his secrets. And he had a guy that just said, look, I just want you to teach me. You don't have to do it. You teach me how to do it. And the guy they had do that was a guy that was kind of an heir. He wasn't necessarily thought of as a serious titan, because he was thought to be a Richie Rich. But that guy was really smart and was really dedicated. And he's the one that and Henry Ford saw that in him and said, okay, I get it. You're not here for show. You really want to do this. So I'm an American. We're going to do it. Anyway, you have to watch that miniseries. I forget the name of it, but it is very, very, very good. And that's all I got to tell you about Pearl Harbor. It's a shame this story was wasted on them. Just a members only. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm thinking about doing another call-in show tomorrow. I may do that early evening. I might not. Who knows what I'll do on this show. But I do appreciate those of you who are here. We could do overrated, underrated. But I don't think there's enough people to really make it interesting for us. And everyone that's listening right now seems to be extremely well-versed in Pearl Harbor, as well as other historical events. I'd like to thank Rumpled Trenchcoat and Julian Zeezer for their fine contributions to the chat. And, it's been a nice little tour through a terrible event. But at the same time, one that, in my opinion, you can look back on all of the things the United States has done through history, from space exploration to the invention of the automobile and the interchangeable part, all down the line. I think, for me, World War II and the United States involvement might have been the defining moment for the United States as a nation, or at least the defining event. Yes, the Revolutionary War. Yes, the Civil. Yes, many things, but this was a war we didn't want, and someone attacked us without warning. I think if they had attacked us with warning, reasonable warning, would be a different story. But they attacked us without warning, and that galvanized the American people. And also you have to remember that at that time, when you defeated a country in a war, you took it over. And had Japan and Germany and Italy won the war, we probably couldn't have been invaded. That's always been a problem, an invading force taking over the vast expanse of the United States, particularly in the early 40s when we were a more agrarian society and everybody had a gun and knew how to use it for hunting or whatever. I don't think you could have done that, but they could have starved us off. Certainly there'd be no more exports. Certainly there'd be no more imports, which no big deal. We're in the United States. We grow our own food. We have our own oil. We do all those things ourselves. But once the United States and all the people, and with the fear that those guys could, maybe take over our way of life, that was a very real fear. Our industrial might was more than anyone could contend with. We talk about the war in Europe and the Panzer tanks and how awesome they were. And they were just state-of-the-art and amazing. And yes, and the Tigers. But we had the Sherman tank. And the Sherman tank might not have been as good, but it didn't require the maintenance that the German tanks required. And oh, by the way, we built 8 to 12 of them for every one of the German tanks. So that scene in Fury where they're attacking the German tank and you see 4 or 5 Shermans go down. But eventually, and it was not an uncommon sight in World War II to see, a German tank that had been destroyed with 4 or 5 Shermans with holes through them surrounding it. We just outproduced them. And they just didn't know what they were getting into. It's like, do you really want our whole country getting up in the morning, going to bed at night, doing nothing but making ammo and planes and tanks and ships? I don't think you want that. I really don't. There's some amazing figures on our output during that time. I probably should have looked some of them up, but it's probably a topic. I mean, industrial might of the U.S. during World War II is a show unto itself. But that moment, those people, those 17, 18-year-old kids, the greatest generation, all of that, that to me, personally, reasonable people can disagree, that is the defining moment of the United States, because that war was fought for international reasons. It was fought for reasons of self-protection. It was fought for moral reasons too. Not only in retribution for that attack, but what was going on in Germany, what was going on in Japan and China and Manchuria and the rest. That to me is the generation that was just everybody steps up, everybody plays their role, everybody does their job, and we're all in this together. And I think that's the reason that books and movies about World War II are so popular, is that people recognize that was, I mean, our military before then, if you watch any of the Why We Fight series, which I would show if YouTube wouldn't ding me on that public domain produced by the government movie. I paid for it, you paid for, well, our ancestors paid for it, but it was paid for with U.S. tax money. It's like, how can this be public domain? It wasn't public domain when he released it, Frank Capra. But anyway, and the U.S. government. That's when we put on our big boy pants and became an international superpower. Not just a power, a superpower. And I think the message at that point was clear, because they'd been fighting the war in Europe. And that wasn't going so well. It was going okay, but it wasn't going so well. Then we got involved, and all the great work of the British and the French resistance and the rest was just given fuel by the American war machine that we pretty much created from scratch, just because of this threat. So let's see here. Uncle Trenchcoat says, that was awesome, Tom. Thank you for all that research and those photos. Yeah, I don't deserve any praise for the photos. Those are just the ones I could find that I can legally use. But they turned out to be some good ones, especially this. This is the actual, it's got all the information on it, and then it's got the code number at the top, and then is channel clear? And you can see it looks like varying darknesses of pencil, or this was on a carbon and some of the stuff bled through. I don't think that's the case, but St. Louis has just passed through the channel and has cleared. Z-bulk goes, I don't know what that means. Call up, was held up pending St. Louis running. Okay, so that communique was held up till they could find out what was going on with the St. Louis, which I assume was communicated to them by the ship itself or by people on the shore, or it could have been one of the planes, I suppose. There was very few planes in the air that were American, but it could have been. Julian Zeta says, is Mackinder's Heartland theory show-worthy? Probably not, but I think how the Axis land Soviets justified their land grabs. Axis and the Soviets justified their land grab. It might be show worthy. It's kind of a deep dive, but maybe. I could do a show just on the home front during World War II and the rationing and what life was like during World War II, both here and in Europe. Europe had the blackouts. We had blackouts here, but they were largely preparational. And we all know that the Japanese had these balloons with bombs on them that they sent over with all this studying of weather currents and various things. And those balloons, actually, a few of them did hit. And I think one person was even killed. But I think that person was killed either inspecting it or going over to see what it was or whatever. I could get more into that too, I suppose. I mean, everything's show worthy to me. So, be careful. I'll do a show on some. Anyway, you guys have been awesome. You got a Saturday to enjoy. I hope you're warm wherever you are. I'm freezing my little tuchus off here. So if nothing else, we'll see you on Monday. Thank you so much for being here. But more importantly, thank you for being a member of the show and supporting it and telling your family and friends about it and insisting to people that you work with that they have to listen, which I know you're all doing at all times. This means I'm being funny. Anyway, you guys are the best, and I do appreciate it very, very, very much. I'm slowly working toward upgrading the show in every way possible so that I can do this all the time and not have to, do other things. And with all that being said, I'd like to thank President Franklin Delano Roosevelt for his special appearance today, as well as both houses of Congress in 1941. And till next time, we'll see you next time.
I don't wanna talk about that. stop.